Sometimes it's difficult to explain why others go through life being liked, and then you have others going through life struggling for recognition. Now, sometimes you can put your finger on it, and you can say, that person has certain qualities, that's why people like him. His wisdom, his wit, his looks, etc. Sometimes you can't even pinpoint it. There's nothing special about Ruvain as opposed to Shimon. But for some reason, everyone likes Ruvain, and Shimon struggles to let people know that he exists. There's a word for that in Lashon Kodesh, and the word is called chen. The Shamshua Fall Hirsch explains that the word chen has its roots in the word china, which means nothing. Sometimes it's a matana min hashemayim. One person has charisma. You can't explain it, you can't rationalize it. You just know that when he talks, people like what he says. When he comes, people value his company. That's called chen. He's a b'chein-iftika person. Favor is the closest word in English that could possibly attempt to translate it. But it falls short. Chen is a matana min hashemayim. The Gemara says that Esther was really not attractive at all. As a matter of fact, the Gemara says she had a very pale complexion. But she had a chut shel chesed. She had a special chen, a matana min hashemayim, that made people like her. We're mispalo for this chen every day. When we ask Hashem for chen and chesed and rachamim, sometimes there's a chen, which is a direct matana from Shemayim. It's the kedusha that radiates from the person, like the rays of the sun. My 8-year-old tells me that there's a boy in his class named Charlie. And everybody likes Charlie, he says. By recess, everyone crowds around Charlie. When it comes time to go home, everyone on the bus wants to sit next to Charlie. And it's not even that Charlie is any better nash than anyone else. Charlie isn't necessarily smarter than anyone else. But everybody likes him. Everyone wants to play with him. And then my 8-year-old comes home and he tells me the good news. Guess what? Charlie is coming to camp, and he may be in the same bunk with him. Now my son, my 8-year-old, and Charlie are going to be the only two friends in the bunk. The other boys are going to be coming from different yeshivas, and they're going to have to get to know each other. So the first day of day camp is over, and my 8-year-old comes home and he tells me and my wife, guess what? We made so many new friends. And Charlie came today. Yes, sure he did. And you know what? By the first recess, everyone crowded around Charlie. Already everyone likes him. And then he thought for a couple of moments and he asked us, how did everyone know to like Charlie? As if to say, in yeshiva, the rule has already been given over. That halacha that Charlie is supposed to be liked is known to the class. But these were all new boys on the first day. They were hardly initiated to each other. How did they already know to like Charlie, to crowd around him, to listen to what Charlie has to say? So it's hard to explain to an 8-year-old that Charlie has the bracha of chen. Some people have it when they're children, they lose it when they get older. Some people don't have it when they're children, and they gain it when they get older. But regardless, it's a special bracha from Shemayim. The Heilig Division has said that's what happened with Abramovino. He said to Sarah, we have to be concerned. You're an attractive person. The Mitzrayim are so terribly immoral. What is going to be? You must say that you're my sister, and so on. What happened over here? As Rashi asks, did Abramovino not know until now the qualities of his wife? They had been married for many, many decades. And suddenly he says to her, Behinina Yadati, oh, now I realize. Until now he did not know. Zak the Heilige Division. Until now, Abramovino appreciated Sarah for her many qualities. He listened to her advice. He built her tent before he built his tent. He knew what a great tzedekah she was. He knew how smart she was. And yes, he also knew that Sarai had a tremendous chen. But Abramovino, given his lofty madriga, attributed Sarai's attractiveness to a ruchniistic chen, to a spiritual matana min hashemayim. However, coming into the Eretz Haaretz, coming into Mitzrayim, where the Torah is so great, where the pollution in the air is so immoral, Abramovino knew that any ruchniistic kedusha, any spiritual charisma, would quickly evaporate into the air. And by noticing that Sarai had maintained this attractive quality, even in Mitzrayim, it occurred to Abramovino for the first time that in addition to the special chayim that surely Sarai had, she also had a physical attractiveness. And therefore, we have to be concerned now because we know who the Mitzrayim are. So the Hinina Yadati, now I know, now that we're in Mitzrayim, and surely any ruchnius the chayim would have disappeared, it occurs to me for the first time that you have other qualities as well, what the world would consider being attractive. And therefore, we must be concerned. The truth is, if we take a closer look at this Rashi that explains V'hinino yadati ki ishi yasas mara'at, and indeed Rashi directs the question to us, being they had been married for so many years, almost a century, didn't Abramovino know until now that she was an isha yasas mara'at? So Rashi offers three explanations. Explanation number one, mitoch tznius shehoysa b'neihem, because of the great level of modesty, Avram never realized. He just happened to realize it now. Mitoch ma'isa, Rashi doesn't mention the ma'isa, but Rashi is referring to the ma'isa brought out in the Medrash. They were crossing in a boat, and Avram by chance glanced into the water, and he noticed Sarai's image. The second shot Rashi says is that indeed Avram was aware of it until now, except he assumed usually mitoyach haderech, from the burden of traveling, a person's looks and his other features or her features are exhausted because of the tirchas haderech. And until now he relied on that, assuming that Sarai's appearance would not be a problem, but he noticed now that contrary to the norm, Sarai did not lose any of her features, albeit the difficult journey. The third shot, Rashi says, is that he knew all along that indeed Sarai had this quality, but the Hinina Yadati ki ishi yasas mara'at means now the time has come, being that we're coming into Mitzrayim, such a terrible place. Now we have to be concerned for this, and we have to do something, we have to take precaution. Now, Rashi gives us a sequence of the tirutzim over here. Note the three different answers. Let me repeat it again. Answer number one, Avram didn't know until now? Yes, Avram did not know until now. He never knew what his wife looked like until by chance he happened to notice it. Second shot, he thought that because of the traveling, she would not look as good. And the third shot is that he knew all along, but now the time has come to worry about it. Now, here's an interesting point. Normally, Rashi gives us the simplest shot first, and only then does Rashi extend into other midrashim, or sometimes alludes to inyanim of soid and secrets and so on. If I ask you to list these three tirutzim in the order of what is the easiest shot to understand, and then to step over into perhaps more complex shot, wouldn't you say that the easiest shot to understand is that Avram knew all along, except now the time has come to worry about it? Then I would list the second shot, that I would think mitayach haderech she would lose it, and she didn't lose any of it. And then I'll tell you, al pi drush, you could even say, Abramovino, should be the greatest chiddush. Abramovino, even though he was married to Sarai for all these decades, he never knew what she looked like until by chance he happened to glance into the water. I would think that would be the order if we went from the simplest shot to the most interesting shot. Yet Rashi quotes the first shot, that Itaka did not know what she looked like, as shot number one, as the primary shot over here. The truth is maybe that fits the best into the words of Hinina Yadati, only now I know. But perhaps there's another underlying message that Rashi wants to impress upon us here. Rashi wants to impress upon us who the others are. By Avram Avinu, this is the simplest shot, that he really did not know what she looked like all these years. Difficult to understand? Hard to accept? That's because you're not putting Avram Avinu into the proper perspective. If you place the Avos in the category that they ought to be placed in terms of how much we could understand them, then this should be the simplest shot. Adarab. Chazal tell us Avos hein hein hamarkava. The Avos are the wagon of the Shechina. What does the wagon of the Shekhinah mean? What kind of a compliment is that, to call someone a wagon? Father Chanurach used to say b'shem the Balatanya. The quality of a wagon and a good team of horses is that you control it properly. And they're quick to adjust themselves to any command, to every curve on the road, to every wish that you have. Pardon the analogy. But when a car company really wants to portray their product, so they impress upon you a sense of control, you can accelerate as quickly as your imagination wants. You can stop as urgently as you have to. It hugs the road. In other words, a sense of control. And not to suggest that this is the way it ought to be, but in terms of the advertising chachamim that sit and ponder over this, they sell the automobile the way many people view the automobile, as an extension of their mobility, a sense of power. So a wagon or a car is only as good as it listens to the driver, as it reacts to the controls that are available to the driver. Avos hanging on our cover, the others of the wagon, means that the Avos and the Ratzon Hashem were one. Just like when I turn the steering wheel, the car turns, that's how the Avos subjugated themselves to the Rebbeinu Shalom. We all want to fulfill the Ratzon of Hashem. But for us, there's life down here, and there's also the Ratzon of Hashem. Yes, and if we give tzedakah, the Rebbe will give us bracha, and indeed all of that is true. And if we learn and we have a ruchniistic life, our children will be better. In all due respect to that. But it's basically a gashmiistic life that we live, and we want to inject the Ratzon Hashem into it. But the others was different. The others lived for the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom. That was their primary will. Their own personal life was non-existent. Tzaddikim used to say during Pashas Bereshis, there was still a certain sense of apprehension. Perhaps a carryover from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Yemei HaDin. And then Pashas Noach, you also have din, punishment. When they got to lech lecha, they breathed a sigh of relief. As if to say, now we were through a most difficult trip, but now we got to grandfather and grandmother's house. Now it's warm. People during the concentration camps would remark how sometimes what saved them was when they could close their eyes and dream they were in their grandmother's house, in their grandfather's house, and the grandmother would wrap that scarf around their neck 1,000 times because, after all, it had dipped a couple of degrees below 70. And a warm, good kugel, and their grandfather would hug them and say, here, let me tell you a nice Dvar Torah. That's what the deacons felt when they got to Pashas Lech Lecha. We're by our Avos. We're by our grandfather. One of my rebbeim traveled throughout Yisrael often with great affection, and someone once asked him, do you have relatives there? He said, of course, I have a mother there. And the man, knowing the family of this person, said, you have a mother there? And he said, don't we all? A mama Rachel. The Lelever Rebbe used to fear Tish by Kever Rachel. And he would say, bring in as many archon as we can to feed over here. A mother likes when she sees her children eat. The idea, the concept, is that the Avos committed themselves for Klal Yisrael. They didn't live for themselves. And whether in this world or Yenevel, whether it's for people that are alive or in Shamais making the ascent to Shemayim, the Avos are there for us. If you put Abramovino in the proper perspective, and you can't really put Abramovino in the proper perspective in terms of really understanding who Abramovino was, but you can put it into the perspective of how we should view it, to the limits of what our minds can understand. And that is that Abramovino didn't think the way we think. Abramovino didn't live the way we live. And therefore Rashi says the simplest answer to the question of Hino Yadati Ki Isha Yifas Marat is he never knew what she looked like. No, Avram didn't know. By chance he looked into the water and he noticed her image. It's interesting to note the Veltz of the Maisa in Pashas Truma, when Rashi describes the ephod, the kind of apron that the Kohen Gadol wore, so Rashi says it's like the aprons that the princesses wear when they go riding on their wagon. And Rashi introduces this explanation by saying, Libi oimerli, my heart tells me that that's what the ephod of the Kohen Gadol looked like. A little bit odd. What does Rashi have to do with princesses riding on wagons? So the Velt says a story that Rashi was always very careful when he walked on the street, that he never looked past his Dalet Amos, never looked more than 4 cubits, so that his eye shouldn't have to see anything that was not necessary for him to see. And once, by chance, Rashi turned a corner, and he glanced upwards, and a wagon passed by, and there was a princess sitting on the wagon. Now, mark my words, Rashi did not see the princess, but he did see her apron. Even that bothered Rashi. Why was there like a piece in his madriga? Why was there some sort of a letdown in the guard over here? And then Rashi came to Parashat Truma. And Rashi tried to explain what the aphid looks like. And in the absence of a diagram or a blackboard, it's difficult to explain these things. You have to find the right words to be able to portray an image, to paint the picture verbally. And suddenly Rashi said, wait a second, I know how to explain it. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu caused me to glance at that. Not because I lost some of my madriga. Rashi was thrilled. Oh, now I know the reason why I had to see it. Libi Oimerli, Rashi says in Parashat Truma, my heart tells me that you know what the aphid looks like? You know the right way to explain it? Like the apron that the princesses wear. That's why I saw it. And then he explained that this is what happened over here as well. The Medrash says that Abramovino was riding on the boat, and he looked down at the water, and he glances, and he sees Sarah's image. He says to himself, how come it never occurred to me till now that my wife was an Isha Yisas Nahar? Now, albeit, it's not exactly the worst thing in the world for a person to recognize that, but for anyone else that may not be considered a fate at all. On the contrary, however, for Abramovino, it was a slight downturn he felt in his madriga. And Abramovino thought for a moment, why should this happen to me now, that I should glance into the water and notice this? There must be a reason. And right away, Abramovino attributed to, there's a reason in the Shemaim they wanted me to know this now. They wanted me to recognize this. It must be they're telling me something. So Avram rationalized, what are they telling me? That we're coming into Mitzrayim, and now this is a problem, and we must take precaution. Now I know. I glanced into the water, and this thought occurred to me, and now I know why Abramovino said. Now, another shot that he also once heard from Behela Gerizhina, Abramovino never had this machshava, even though he had been married to Sarah for many decades. Suddenly they come to Mitzrayim, and he glances into the water as they're on this boat, and it occurs to him that his wife has this quality. And Abramovino says to himself, how come this occurred to me now, and never beforehand? It must be that the Eretz Haaretz, the moral low ground over here in Mitzrayim, is so barbaric, is so terrible, that it even affected my madriga. Even I lost some of my Kedusha. And therefore he told Sarah, you must be concerned. In other words, because I had this thought until now, which again for someone else wouldn't even be a concern, but for Abramovino's madriga, relatively he felt there was a priest in his madriga. If the thought never occurred to me until now, and it did now, it must be that I too am affected by the great tumah that exists over here in the air. And if the tumah is so great because the people behave so immorally, then indeed we have to be concerned. Let's think. Now if Abramovino says that even in his madriga, he was affected by it, he was brought down by the environment, what are we to say? What responsibility do we have as parents to be careful as to what comes into our house, what images are projected through various different mediums? How does that affect our children? If Abramovino says that inevitably even he too is affected by environment, what responsibility do we have as parents to make sure what kind of environment exists in our house? Rabbi Yaakov Galinsky, the famous Maggid, Rozan Gesund, repeats an amusing story of an Israeli policeman that was given a directive by his superior, who was not very fond of the Haredim, that today he should give Haredim a hard time. In other words, if you see someone wearing a kippah or with a beard and payas, try to find some type of traffic violation. Do what you have to do. Hide, follow them. Just, I want tickets against Haredim. And so the young officer says, fine, I'll find something against some Haredi somewhere. So as Rabbi Yaakov says the story, he sees two Haredim riding by on a motorcycle, and he follows them. And he follows them for more than a half hour. There's only one problem. We have a red light, they stop. We have a stop sign, they stop. We have a turn, they signal. So finally he's so terribly frustrated, after a half hour, he pulls them over. And they say to him, officer, what did we do wrong? And he says to them, I'm following you for a half hour and I'm hiding. You shouldn't see me. How is it that you stop by every stop sign and you're stopping by every red light, you're signaling by every turn, as if you were taking your road test? What are you trying to do to me? Don't you know I have a job to do and my superior told me I'm supposed to give tickets to Charedim today? So they said to him, look, we didn't know that you're following us, but the Rebbeinu Shalom was with us. It was Bashet. We should be good boys today. So he scratches his head for a couple of moments and says, did you say that the Rebbeinu Shalom was with you? That's it. And he starts writing a ticket. And they say, well, what did we do wrong? And he answers, well, you can't have 3 on a motorcycle. Of course, when things go your way and you don't get a ticket, it's easy to feel that the Rebbeinu Shalom is with you. But the Messiah is to understand that the Rebbeinu Shalom is with us even when things apparently don't go our way. And that, in a sense, is the theme of Parshas Lech as we see it through and through. Abramovino was given a most difficult task, to leave. Now, leaving wasn't the problem, but it meant that Abramovino would allow for his old father to remain alone in his old age. What would people say about that? That was exactly against the whole essence of the image that Abramovino wanted to portray, one of chesed, one of loving kindness. And here the whole world is going to talk that Abramovino leaves his old father alone and travels off to some unknown destination. In reality, the Midrashim tell us that his father and brothers were planning a scheme to kill him. But these are things we find out later, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was there with us and was directing us and guiding us. And this theme repeats itself throughout the entire Parsha. Abramovino is doing his best. He proceeds with a blind faith, and seemingly, what does he have for it? Frustration. He leaves, and as he's traveling from city to city, the Medrash tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Abramovino exactly what was going to happen to Klal Yisrael in future times at each city, and he's mispower for that. And one would imagine if you're told to leave and you leave with Mesiras Nefesh, now HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you take care of me. Now I want to see scenes of bliss, scenes of blessing, scenes of wonderful things that are going to happen. And Abramovino has shown the truth. He's shown the reality of Golus, of what Klal Yisrael is going to have to endure before Mashiach comes. And he continues on. His Messiah with Sarai, the great Messiah of the hunger. Avram arrives in Eretz Canaan. He begins to teach people there's a Rebbeinu Shalom in the world. Everyone drops their Avodah Zarah. They come flocking to Abramovino, and what happens? A hunger. And the people come running to Abramovino and they say, what did you do to us? There's only a hunger in this land, not even in the neighboring land. Who asked you to come here and start teaching us about a Rebbeinu Shalom? Abramovino asks no questions. He does what Yidden have done. There are times he just has to continue on, and he leaves for Mitzrayim. Whether he was supposed to or not is an issue in the Rishonim. One thing is for sure. One thing is no issue. Abramovino asked no questions. Now, Maisa, a similar bottom, the Nefesh HaChaim says, how was Klal Yisrael able to survive the hunger and the difficulties in the ghettos throughout the years and continue to teach their children Torah and be mamshech emunah to their hearts? That was because Avram Avinu did so under these circumstances. Avram had to experience this in order to pave the way, in order for Klal Yisrael to be able to survive. But Avram didn't ask for explanations. He just asked, okay, what can I do now? Likewise, the Messiah with Sarai in Parai's palace also paved the way for Klal Yisrael's Mesiras Nefesh of Tznius and Kiddusha in Mitzrayim. His leaving Mitzrayim with great riches would be a forerunner for what's going to happen with the Bnei Yisrael when they leave Mitzrayim. Avram went through all of these Messiahs to pave the way for Klal Yisrael, but B'Shas Maisa, there was the Messiah. There was the difficulty. The Chedush Yerim says, don't fool yourself. The term Messiah test means that while the person is enduring the test, he doesn't have all these explanations. He proceeds with a blind faith. And while in retrospect, Avraham Avinu's reaction to all of these difficulties were the seeds of our survival, the B'Shas Maisa, during the difficult time, as it was happening, Avraham Avinu couldn't understand it any more than we can understand it. But he didn't attempt to understand it. He knew that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was with you. He knew it wasn't him and Sarai, it was him, Sarai, and the Rebbeinu Shalom was with them. And is this a lot easier said than done? By all means. That's why we needed an Abramovino to pave the way for us. And this leads us to the point of our discussion. Afterwards we have Avram's Messiah of light, and he goes and risks his life, and he travels to free him. And when he arrives at the outskirts of Damascus, he battles the 4 kings, and Hashem assists him in a supernatural manner. Whenever Avram picked up earth to hurl at the enemy, it turned into bows and arrows, but when Avrafel shot arrows, they turned into dust. We all know the famous story that the Gemara in Newness tells us about Newness Gamzu, who always said, Gamzu l'taiva, no matter what hardship befell him. He was steadfast in his conviction that no evil comes from the Rebbeinu Shalom. Whatever happens to a person is good. That's the word mispal for a shana toiva u'mesuka, a good year and a sweet year. Good. Whatever the Rebbeinu Shalom does is good. We're just mispal that it should also be sweet. It's not always sweet to us, but it's good. So we all know the story. Once the Yidden of Eretz Yisrael wanted to send a gift to the Roman Emperor, and they looked for an emissary and decided that Newness Gamzu was the right person. And they gave him a chest of precious stones that was switched in the inn. Robbers filled up the chest with earth, took the diamonds for themselves. Newness Gamzu presents it to the king, and when he sees earth, the king is furious. He has Newness Gamzu locked up, and he says the Jews will pay bitter for this mocking gesture. Newness Gamzu's response, Gamzu l'taiva, whatever Hashem does is good. And Eliyahu Navi appears as one of the ministers, and he suggests to the king, it is possible that the Yidden have sent you the earth of their forefather Avram. The earth is known to work miracles. When Avram picked it up and threw it at the 4 mighty kings, it turned into lethal arrows. And the emperor at that time was struggling with a war against another country. And he figured it's worth a try to test these perhaps new kind of ammunition. And so he reluctantly had it thrown against them, and lo and behold, it turns into lethal arrows and tremendous weapons of the type that he had never even known existed, and he wins the war. And he summons Newness Gamzu, and they give him the greatest honor. They fill the box with diamonds, and they send it back with him. More important than the diamonds, the decree that Newness Gamzu came to seek to annul was undone. And the Gemara tells us that the innkeepers who were the thieves to start with says, really, if we have this kind of earth in our backyard, we ought to try it ourselves. And they did. They brought it to the king, and he tried throwing that earth, and it was nothing but earth. And these robbers that tried to undo Newness Gamzu were severely punished. Now the Gemara in Newness tells us another story about Newness Gamzu. The Gemara tells us Newness Gamzu was traveling, and a poor person came over to him, and he asked him for food. Newness Gamzu got off his donkey, he tried to open his packages and give him food. But by the time he took the food out, the poor person collapsed and died. Newness Gamzu was very overwhelmed by this incident and extremely sad. He blamed himself for not acting with enough zrizas, for not moving quick enough. Had he jumped off the donkey and ran to the bag instead of just climbing off and walking over to it, perhaps the poor person would have lived. And as a result, he was makabel upon himself a most harsh einish. He said that his hands that were too slow removing the food should fall off. His feet that were too slow jumping off the donkey and running to the food should fall off. And as a result, Newness Gamzu was left in a bed. He could not move. His talmidim stood around him and learned Torah. The 4 legs of his bed were immersed in 4 pails of water to keep the insects away, which he could not shoo away with his own hands. And then once, while the talmidim were sitting around him, they heard a creak. The beams were giving in. It looked like the house was going to cave in. Right away they ran and they grabbed the bed of Newness Gamzu to carry it outside. So Newness Gamzu told them, no. First carry out the kalim, carry out the utensils of the house, then take me out. If you take me out, the house is going to cave in. Everything will be lost. First, take out the furniture, and then take me out. But Rebbe, you're putting yourself in danger. He said, don't worry. As long as I am here, the roof won't cave in. And so the talmidim took out all the furniture, then they took out Newness Gamzu, and afterwards the roof caved in. Reb Chaim Vital, the great Talmud of the Arizal, in the Shar HaKidusha explains that all the destructive forces of this world emanate from the person's own sins. The 4 Yesodis that make up the world are Eish, Ruach, Mayim, and Afar. The fire, winds, which include all gases, water, and offer, which include all solids and dust. The Chaim Vital explains, for example, the Yesod HaEsh represents Gaiva. Fire works its way up. The Baal Gaiva makes himself vulnerable to Eish. The Gemara tells us a story about Reb Zera, who was known for his modesty. He was referred to as Reb Zera, the small one, who would test himself by actually going into an oven. And indeed, he was not burnt. So what really saved Abramovino from the fires of Ur Kasdim? His modesty. His unbelievable madriga of anifos. Because he had completely mastered the koyach ha'esh against Gaiva, therefore Eish could not harm him. From the Yesod Hamayim, from water, all the taivos and pleasant and sweet things grow in this world. One who masters lust and temptation cannot be hurt by water. As a result, by Kriyas Yamsef, the pasuk says, Ma Ra, what did the Yam see that made it split? That it had to give in and go against its nature? Ra Aroine Shel Yosef. Yosef a tzaddik mastered the great Messiah, and as a result, the Yesod Hamayim had to cave into Yosef, not the other way around. From the Yesod Haruach, that Chaim Vital explains, the winds, the gases, that corresponds to speech, the Ruach Memalula, which in a way should give us a lot of food for thought. What is the greatest threat today to our society? It is what the Ummah Olam did with technology, and that is to create weapons of mass destruction that are all basically based on the Yesod HaRuach. We're worried about gases, we're worried about missiles flying through the air and so on. Maybe the Rebbeinu Shalom protect Klal Yisrael. What Rav Chaim Vital is telling us. You want the Yesod HaRuach to work for you or Chas v'Shalom against you. So be careful in the way we speak. If we master over the Yesod HaRuach, and we avoid Lashon Hara and Rechilus and words of sin, and we engage our mouth for Kiddusha, to be mechazik others, to help others, for limud HaTorah, and so on, then that is the greatest chus Klal Yisrael can have, more so than any anti-missile defense system. The Chavetz Chaim talks about this at great length at the beginning of the Sefer Shmiras HaLashon. He explains that the more ruchnius something is, the less physical, and the more spiritual, then the greater either the potential damage or reward. Hurricanes and winds can do a lot more damage than solid rocks falling on things. And the Yesod HaRuach is the Yesod of speech. Speech, which is ruchnius, has much greater ramifications, both on the blessing side and Chas v'Shalom to the contrary, if we don't adhere to keeping our mouth clean. Okay, so we have Eish, that represents Gaiva. One who masters Gaiva doesn't worry about Eish. We have Mayim, that's Taida. One who masters Taida doesn't worry about Mayim. We have Ruach, that's speech. One who masters speech doesn't worry about the Yesod Ruach. What about the fourth element? The solid, the offer. Dr. Chaim Vital, from the Yesod offer comes two things, Atzlus and Atzlus, which are of course interrelated. Atzlus means depression, and Atzlus is being lazy. That's the Yesod offer. That drives the person into bed. I don't want to hear from the world. I'm just laying here. I don't want to talk to anyone. I don't want to do anything. Now, who personifies exactly the opposite? Who is the one that jumped for joy, given life's greatest challenges? Who was able to look the greatest danger in the face and say, Gamzu l'toiv? It's Nachum Ish Gamzu. So Nachum Ish Gamzu masters over the Yesod ha'ofar. That's why the Ber Shmuel explains, Nachum Ish Gamzu told us from Eden, take the furniture out first. The Yesod ha'ofar, the stones, the bricks, the wood that make up this house cannot hurt me. As long as I am here, you will see the house will not cave in. It's a shad about the furniture. Take it out. Now, if you do it by tzaddikim, when they master in a certain concept, when the tablecloth is perfectly white, so the tiniest speck stands out a lot. And therefore, tzaddikim punish themselves harshly. And they have to face the midas hadin if there's even a small deviation, a small chait, in what is particularly their lifetime goal, their specialty. And tzaddikim want this, so that their reward in Olam Haba should be complete, beyond the level of what normal people can attain. So Nachum Ish Gamzu was a little bit slow, moving to give the ani food, As a result, he was makabel upon himself the most severe punishment, because he said, I can't afford to have a fault in this regard. Fighting atzvus and atzvus, this is my specialty, this is my life. And that's why he was quick to be makabel upon himself the worst punishment, so that his shema comes up 100% clear in this regard. But Nachum Gamzu knew that L'maisa, he had a complete kapara. He knew he had mastered over atzvus and atzvus in such a way that the Yisrael offer cannot punish him. Take the furniture out first, it won't hurt me, you'll see. And that also explains how Abramovino picks up the earth and throws it at his enemies, and suddenly it becomes weapons of mass, well, let's say mass defense for Abramovino. The enemy cannot hurt him. Nachum Gamzu presents the emperor with a chest of dust. He's not the least bit worried. The emperor is enraged. He has Nachum Gamzu thrown into prison. He threatens all of the Jews. Nachum Gamzu applies his lifetime policy of whatever will be, will be. Gamzu l'tov. Whatever Kadosh Baruch Hu does is for good. And it is precisely for this reason, this lifetime battle against depression and laziness, that this very earthly presented to the king could not harm him. On the contrary, it serves him. It becomes a present far better than the pearls and diamonds he would have brought. The dust defends Nachum Gamzu. The dust destroys the king's enemy. Nachum Gamzu is sent home with riches. He's sent home with gold and silver. And when others try to use the very same dust, others who personify exactly the opposite of Nachum Gamzu, a lack of amun, a lack of betachon, those who try to scheme and steal, they don't quite get the same results. And while these madrigas may be above our heads, attaching ourselves to the avos and to the memori chazal that protect us and guide us, particularly whatever Abramovino did, he did it with us in mind. This is definitely within our reach. Rav Schwab explains that every yid is really a component of two different forces. Both are supposed to be going in the same direction, but they come from different perspectives. One is the Messiah from his parents. The other is the particular script and story of his own life. The Gemara in Sachin, as quoted by Rashi in our Sedra, tells us as follows. Under Reb Shimon ben Lakish, the Ezcha L'Goy Gada, Hashem promised Abramovino, I will make you into a great nation. And that is why we say, Elikei Avram, V'Yavracheka, and I will bless you. That is why we say, Elikei Yitzchak. V'Yagad L'Shemecha, that is why we say, Elikei Yaakov. However, I would think that when it comes to the end of the bracha, we would also mention all the others. Therefore, the pasuk goes on to say, "V'hayei bracha b'cha chaismin v'yen chaismin b'kulan." We finish only Baruch Ata Hashem Magen Avraham. The Schwab Hamazach explains you have to understand as follows: it's not echad every yid understands, but he's not the beginning of the kiddush. He's part of a chain, and without the Torah Hamasura b'Yadeinu, from one generation to the other, from father to son, from Rebbe to Talmud, we would not know how to serve Hashem. On the other hand, every yid, given his particular neshama, given his particular set of circumstances, given his particular time frame of when he was sent down to this world, he has his own Yetzer Hara and his own nisyonos, his own tests. Chazal tell us, Yitzir Shalodim Yetzer Hara, the person mischadesh olav b'chol yom, misgaber olav b'chol yom. Each day, it's a new Yetzer Hara. Each day there are new difficulties to deal with, new challenges to overcome. And the Yetzer Hara gets stronger and stronger as it goes along. And this is tailor-made. It's designed, custom designed for every single yid. We all have our own nisyonos, new nisyonos. As individuals, we have different nisyonos than others. And with each new day, there are new nisyonos, new tests, new situations, whether we like it or not, we have to leap into and overcome them. So from that point, the person has to view himself as he is the beginning. No one else faced this exact challenge beforehand, and he is the one that has to deal with the test. And because the script was written for him, inevitably there has to be the siyata d'shmaya available for him, should he look deep enough for him to be able to deal with it. So the Tana says at the beginning of the Agadah, Mitzchila oivdei avodah zara haya v'sein. The Akshav, and now HaKadosh Baruch Hu has brought us closer le'avodah. Now HaKadosh Baruch Hu has brought us closer? Matan Torah was 3,000 years ago. 3,000 and change. The lashon should have been Metchila Oivdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Aveseinu. Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the Torah. And afterwards, after HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the Torah, we were brought closer le'avodah. Why is the lashon of the Tana v'achshav and now we were brought closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And the answer is, in all due respect to the Messiah, which is the basis of who we are, every individual faces something new, where he has to apply avodas Hashem to his particular situation. Yes, now you were brought closer to avodas Hashem because now you have an assignment to deal with that no one else has, that you yourself didn't have until this day. And that is why by Shemoneh Esrei, where do we bow down? We bow down at the beginning of the bracha of Avos, where we say Lekei Avram, Lekei Yitzchak, Lekei Yaakov. We offer our praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We are machnia ourselves. Lavidasa Yisbarach Shemai. We understand there's a Messiah of Avos. We were taught the Torah. And our hope and prayer is to be able to do our job in being a successful link to the chain, to be makabel the Torah from our parents and our rebbeim, and in turn transmit that to our children and our talmidim. And incidentally, everybody has talmidim, even those who aren't necessarily in chinuch. Doctors, lawyers, diamond cutters, shoemakers also have talmidim. Reb Moshe Chaim Baruch explains this. Every year before Kriya Shema is mispalel. I beg of you, Hashem, we should be zaycha lilmai to be able to learn Torah, ululamed, and to teach Torah. Does everybody have a schus to teach Torah? Everyone says a shir? Everyone teaches in a classroom? There should be a special tefillah for rebbeim. Lilmai, ululamed. For people, here, say this before you go into a classroom. Yet that's not how Chazal structured it. Every single yid says this tefillah every single morning of his life. Whether it's an ordinary day, whether it's Yom Kippur, whether it's Tisha B'Av. Why? Because every yid, whether he likes it or not, is a Rebbe. The way you put on tefillin, the way you act, the way you say good morning to someone, the way you pay your bill, the way you ask someone else for money that is owed to you, the way you walk on the street, the way you stand on a line. You're a Rebbe. People are learning from you. People are using you as an example. And especially a Ben Torah or someone who is dressed as a Frum Yid. Wherever he walks, he doesn't even realize he's a Rebbe, that he's teaching. And that's why every Yid has to be Mispalo Lilmai Dulamed. So getting back to how Rav Schwab explains this Gemara in our Parsha. The first bowing down by Lekei Avram is a thank you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we were Zaycha to be makabel from our Avos. And we thank Hashem for the opportunity of having the schus to transmit that Torah to future generations. And here indeed we reach out to the schus of Abramovino to help us. Because whatever Abramovino did, he did for future generations. That's why they're called Avos. There were tzaddikim before Abramovino, but they weren't called Avos, even though technically they're our fathers. We come from them. So why is it that Abramovino is the first to be called our father? The Ben Moshe from the Yerusha Rebbe Chaim Baruch explains because Abramovino was the first who lived his life. Every act that he did, every mitzvah that he did, every bracha that he made was not for himself. He had in mind, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, help me implant and inject a kedusha, a emunah in all of my children, all of my descendants. Whatever Abramovino did in his lifetime, he didn't do for himself. He did for his children, like a father. And that's why we draw from the energy that Abramovino really set into motion for us to be able to continue this aspect of our mahus, of our essence, to be a successful receiver and in turn transmitter of Kiddush and holiness to our children. And that's what we're bowing down for. That's what we're saying thank you for at the beginning of our Shemoneh Esrei. When we say, Baruch Atah Hashem, Lekei Avram, Lekei Yitzchak, Lekei Yaakov. We want to continue what the Avos set into motion. At the end of the bracha, however, we put Abramovino into a separate category, different than Yitzchak and Yaakov, and we are saying exclusively Baruch Ata Hashem Mogen Avraham. This bowing down by Baruch Ata Hashem Mogen Avraham at the end of the bracha is a thank you to Hashem from a completely different angle. Abramovino didn't have a father to be makabel his Messiah from. Abramovino was chila legeris, was av hamoin goyim. Avram ha'ivri. Why was he called ha'ivri? Because the entire world was on one side and he was on the other side. He was me'ever acher. So Avram dealt with a situation in life that he had no tradition as to how to deal with. He had no instructions as to how to deal with. He was thrust into it. He somehow had to be mashpia amuna into a world that was completely void of any kind of faith. A world that was not only skeptical about amuna in the Kadosh Baruch Hu, but antagonistic and even outright violent against it. And Abramovino dealt with his own particular challenge. And here we say Baruch Ata Hashem Magen Avram, because there's a point in our life that we also, as individuals, face specific challenges that we don't necessarily have direction or advice as to how to do it, although we ought to seek that direction and advice, but it doesn't always come. And if it comes, it isn't always consistent. So a Yid has to know that there's this aspect of humanity also of Yiddishkeit. That's why we say Baruch Ata Hashem Magen Avram, thank you Hashem for being with me, because I know that if I do my best, and I refuse to give up, and I go out, and I try to deal with the situation in the best way that I can, using my best judgment, using whatever Mesiras Nefesh I can muster, then I too will be Zaycha to the Kiddush and the Siyata D'Shmaya, at least to a certain extent of Abramovino. And that's how we finish B'choch Heisman. With you, Baruch Ata Hashem Magen Avram, we finish. Because there is an Inyan Miyuchid, Rav Shlomo Zalman Levacha explains, in the avoid of every single year that is a Pchina of Abramovino, as if he is the beginning of the Kiddusha, the Achshav. You are bringing us closer to your avodah. It never happened until now. We've mentioned earlier, the Yerushalmi says, that when you say over a memra from a tzaddik, you're supposed to imagine that the Baal Shmur is Oymid Lefanav. Amar Abaya, Amar Rava, you say over a Dvatayah from the Chavetz Chaim, from the Chazanish, you're supposed to imagine the person is standing in front of you. That means, says the Chidush area, when we begin to learn Parshas Lech Lecha, we're supposed to sort of imagine, we're supposed to have a feeling that the Avos are in front of us. There are 5 letters in the word Avraham. There are 4 letters in the word Yitzchak, 4 letters in the word Yaakov, a total of 13, corresponding to the Shema of Echad. There's one HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is also numerically equivalent to 13. Sarah has 3 letters, Rivka has 4 letters, Rachel has 3 letters, Leah has 3 letters, also a sum total of 13. Our mothers as well teach us Amunah, our belief in one HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the combination of 13 letters from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and 13 letters from Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah equals 26, which is equivalent to the Shem Havaya of Yud, K, Vav, K, which is also 26. So the beautiful word from Rav Shami after Paul B'chem Levrach. He says, Yagad lo shenecha, Zasha'im Emelokei Yaakov, like we mentioned earlier. Had HaKadosh Baruch Hu not changed Avram's name to Avraham, we would have been 1 letter short. So Yaakov would not be referred to as Yaakov anymore. He would refer to Yisrael to make up for the extra letter. Because Yaakov has 4 letters, Yisrael has 5. Dr. Shamshin Mr. Paula, V'yagad lo shemecha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Abramovino, I will make your name great. Your name will change from Avram to Avraham. Zesha'im Emelokei Yaakov, and therefore we say Elikei Yaakov. Because if Avram was not changed to Avraham, Yaakov would not be referred to Yaakov. Yaakov would be referred to Yisrael. But Yaakov doesn't necessarily have to be referred to Yisrael. We can use the name Yaakov of 4 letters because Avram's name has the extra letter of Avraham, so we have the same number. Let's understand what we're saying over here. The Amunah in our heart, the B'tachon, the basis of our Yiddishkeit, it comes through the Avos. The Shem Havai, which means the presence of the Shechina. The presence of the Shechina within ourselves. The Amunah that we have that the Rebbeinu Shalom is within us, that the Rebbeinu Shalom is around us, that the Rebbeinu Shalom is everything.
That depends on how much we study the Torah, based on how the Oves teach us the Torah. And that's why it corresponds to the Shem Havaya. By the same token, we are reminded that part of this did not come easy to Abramovino. He didn't start out as Abramovino. He started out as Avram. Nowhere to draw from except his own will to get to the truth. And there are times in life that get us flustered. He says, I just don't know what to do. I have no sense of direction. No one can guide me. So the Torah says, lech lecha, then go into yourself. This is part of an assignment. There are times that we don't necessarily have a sense of direction, and you have to look deeper into yourself and try your best, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu will show you that you really did have a sense of direction. The Chedush Yerim said, Baruch Atah Hashem Mogen Avraham. HaKadosh Baruch Hu protects the Nekuda of Abramovino that is in every single Yiddish heart, that Abramovino planted into every one of us. That Soif Kol Soif. Try hard enough and you'll see that the Amunah is there. It's just covered up. The Amunah Setecha says, Baruch Atah Hashem Mogen Avraham is the Gematria Ve'emunafcha Baleilus. And I was zeichet to your faith even at night, even during difficult times. The great tzaddik Pinchas Mekar Zochain Levracha used to be very happy when Parshas Lech Lecha came. He would explain that during the Parshiyos of Bereshis and Noach, there are difficult in Yonim. There's the fate of the sadduce, there's the Mabel. Whatever this means, he said that the Parsha of Bereshis and Noach are from the Yolim HaTayu. The Yoretz says Sayu Vavayu. Sayu still includes the Parshiyos of Bereshis and Noach. From Parshas Lech Lecha and on, you have what's called the Yolim HaTiklim. The Ramban asks, how come Parshas Noach begins with a praise to Noach, an introduction, and now we're going to learn about Noach, a great person. Eila told us, Noach ish tzaddik. Yet Abramovino doesn't get this introduction. He doesn't get this Hagdama. There's no flap on the outside of the book that describes how great Abramovino was as a Hagdama to the story of Abramovino. The passage just begins talking about Abramovino. Lech lecha, go ahead, you're on your own. Who's this Abramovino? How are we supposed to know who he is? The Sefer Emunah Tzitecha suggests this message. Noach was a great person. He was zeichet to his standing as a result of his emunah, his tremendous upholding of belief in a Kadosh Baruch Hu during such difficult times. In all due respect to Noach, if you emulate that kind of Mesiras Nefesh, even in the face of so many people who are against you, the one is also zeicha, obviously, to great madrigas. When the Torah starts telling us about Abramovino, there's a different nekuda over here. The Torah is saying, whether you like it or not, whether you have merited this or not, regardless of what your record is or what your past history is, there is a nekuda of Abramovino within you. When you learn about Noach, you have to understand either you act the way Noach did, or you don't. If you don't, you have no shaychus to him. When we learn about Abramovino, there's a different parsha here. This is Abramovino. He was your grandfather. This is Sarah Meinu. She was your grandmother. Whatever they did for you. There is an akuda of Amunah in your heart that comes directly from them. And you have to take this nakuda of Amunah and you have to knead it out. You have to bake it. You have to turn it into a beautiful challah. You have to apply it to your own nisyonos in life where it'll come out into the open. Baruch Atah Hashem Mogen Avraham is also the gematria shoyrish hanelam, the hidden roots. You look at a big, powerful tree, huge, tall, casts a tremendous shadow around it. The intricate highways of leaves and branches, and to think all of this comes from one little seed. In the components of that seed, you had the potential of this never-ending series of life that continues to produce and nourish. We have to view ourselves in the same light. We all come from Abramovino. In Abramovino was included every single yid outside Kaladayas, just like everything in the tree comes from that seed. And this Shabbos, more so than other times during the year, represents the beginning of that seed sprouting. And that's what Fischel Lakarta says, explains the Newness that from this Shabbos on is the Olam HaTikun. We have to look deep into ourselves to find the strength that our grandfather planted for us. The Medrash tells us that Abramovino was frightened of Yisurim, of pain. Amalei Kadosh Baruch Hu, Eina Tetzarech, there's no reason for you to be frightened of those Yisurim. Kvar noiled mi sheyakableim. Somebody else was born already who is going to receive those Yisurim. And who is that someone else? Utz. Ze'iv. Utz, who is Eve. Shenem, as the Pasuk says, Ishaya, there was a man, the Eretz Utz. And the Pashiyas go on to tell us the story of Eve who suffered like no one else. So it's a pella. What does this mean? Abramovino was worried about Yisurim until he was told, you're not the one who's going to suffer, someone else is going to suffer, Eve is going to suffer. The Sefer Chanukah Satire from the Rebbe of Heschel, who was the Rebbe of the Shach, gives us a rather fascinating insight into this Medrash. The Gemara tells us in the first parak of the Sechtes Brachos, one of the questions that Moshe Rabbeinu asked of HaKadosh Baruch Hu when he went up to Shemayim, why is it that you have sometimes tzaddik v'toivlai, a tzaddik down here in this world, and everything is going good for him, yet on the other hand you have tzaddik v'ralai. You have tzaddikim down here who suffer terrible pain. And by the same token, you have Rishayim that, as we can logically understand, suffer, but then you have Rishayim that have it as good as it can be. Amalai. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe Rabbeinu, tells us the Gemara in the Sechtes Brachos, Tzaddik v'toivlai, who is the tzaddik that has everything going for him and doesn't suffer down here in this world? He is tzaddik ben tzaddik, the son of a tzaddik. And tzaddik v'ralai, who is the tzaddik that suffers? That is tzaddik ben rosh. Frag the Gemara, so are you saying that people suffer for the chatoim of their parents? But the pasuk says, Ubanim lo yimtzu al avos. The children will not suffer. They won't be punished for what their parents did. So why should it be a difference whether someone is a tzaddik ben Rasha or tzaddik ben tzaddik? So the Gemara answers a seemingly different teretz. Tzaddik the toivlai, who is the tzaddik that has everything good down here in this world? He is the tzaddik gomer, the complete tzaddik. Tzaddik the ralai, who is the tzaddik who suffers? He is the tzaddik she'enoi gomer, the tzaddik that is not a complete tzaddik. Now there are a whole host of difficulties over here. First of all, the question of the pasuk of Ubanim lo yumtzu al avos lechayra should not be a difficulty at all. The Gemara deals with this in the Masechta Sanhedrin, and the Gemara says that pasuk applies to other things. Ubanim lo yumtzu al avos doesn't necessarily mean that a child isn't punished for the einish of his parents. It means that the father cannot testify against the son. The Gemara could have answered, suggests the Chanukah Satira, Ubanim lo yumtzu al avos refers to the einish in olam haba. But down here, children are made to suffer the ramifications of their parents' deeds. But the Gemara didn't go this route. Rather, the Gemara insisted that children don't suffer, even down here in this world, as a result of what their parents do. What then was the answer to Moshe Rabbeinu when he asked, how come some tzaddikim have it good, some tzaddikim don't? How come some Rishayim have no problems and others do? So it appears the Gemara gave us a completely different teretz. It has nothing to do with whether his father was a Rosh or a Tzaddik. It has nothing to do with whether he's a Tzaddik ben Tzaddik or Tzaddik ben Rosh. It has to do with whether he's a Tzaddik Gomer or Tzaddik She'ein Gomer, whether he's a Rosh Gomer, Rosh She'ein Gomer. Now, it's difficult over here because we're dealing with explaining a dialogue between Moshe Rabbeinu and Kaviyachol HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When the Gemara initially said that HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered Moshe Rabbeinu, that the tzaddik v'toivlai is the tzaddik ben tzaddik, and the tzaddik v'ralai is the tzaddik ben rasha. So we're not assuming things over here. We're not suggesting things. This is a Messiah that the Gemara had, that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered Moshe Rabbeinu. Then we ask the question, but how does it work out? It says, L'yumsu avos albanim. So it's hard to assume that the Gemara then said, no, it was a mistake. That's not what HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered Moshe Rabbeinu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered Moshe Rabbeinu a different teretz. How come some tzaddikim have it good? They are tzaddikim gemurim. How come some tzaddikim don't have it good? They're a tzaddik that is not complete. Are we changing now what we thought HaKadosh Baruch Hu's answer was? I mean, we had a Messiah about this, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu's answer was. Therefore, sagt the Chanukah Satire, that the Mefarshim bring down from the Chachmei HaEmes, from the Kabbalah, that the Gemara is not changing the answer, the Gemara is clarifying the answer. The initial answer, in other words, our Messiah as to what HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered Moshe Rabbeinu, the tzaddik is a toivloi, the tzaddik who has as good as the tzaddik ben tzaddik, the tzaddik who doesn't have as good as the tzaddik ben rasha, that answer stays. You had a kasha, but la yumsu always albanim. We know that children don't suffer as a result of the wrongdoings of their parents. So the Gemara clarifies you didn't understand the teretz. You didn't understand what HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered Moshe Rabbeinu. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered that the tzaddik ben tzaddik has it good and the tzaddik virali has it difficult, that does not mean whether a person's parents sinned or not. Ben tzaddik or ben rasha refers to something else altogether. A neshama of a tzaddik who was always a tzaddik is called tzaddik ben tzaddik. Then you have the neshama of a rasha who came down here to this world, and that neshama is now doing tshuva, or that neshama has to be misake previous problems. Let's say he wasn't a rasha in his previous gilgul, but he did many things wrong, and he has to be misake those in yanim. That is what we refer to as a tzaddik ben rasha. He is a tzaddik down here, but he has to rectify for certain acts of rishus that he once violated down here in this world, prior to his present state of being. So no one is punished for what their parents did, but there is an union of a person being punished for things that happened in a previous gilgul. Iyov, says the Chanukah Torah, suffered terrible yisurim. Iyov is one of the only svarim in Tanakh that even an oval is allowed to learn. Iyov personifies yisurim and pain. Who was Iyov in his previous gilgul? The Chanukah Torah brings from the Klei Chenza that Iyov was the neshama of Terach, of Abramovino's father. That's also brought down in the Sefer Gilguli Neshama from Maram Nipano Simin Yosef. He brings over there that Amsala Bas Karnavai, who was the wife of Terach and Abramovino's mother, she was Chana, the mother of the one who lost 7 children that didn't want to bow down to the Avodah Zarah. The Gemara in Gittin tells us she told her youngest son, who was even given the option to officially just bow down and pick up a ring that fell to the Avodah Zarah's feet, but he refused to. So she told him, my son, go to Avram, our father, and tell him, you put 1 child on a mizbeach, I brought 7 on them. For you it was just an assignment. For you it was just a test. You took him down. For me it was lemaisa. These words, atan asayin vani lemaisa, don't appear actually in the Gemara, but they do appear in the Medrash Rabbah, in Parshas Eicha, Perik Aleph, on the pasuk of Al Eila Ani Bechia, that Yirmiyahu Navi cried for her and her 7 children. So the Marani Pano said, just like Terach had a takana for the wrongdoings of his life by coming down in the form of Iyov, his wife also suffered by losing those 7 children. And after she lost the 7th child, the Baskol rang out and said, Eim Habonim Semecha. That refers to Eim Habonim also to the mother of Abramovino who had her taken now. For in her first Gilgul, Nimrod threw Abramovino into the Kirshan Eish. And as we know from the Midrashim, Terach, or perhaps Terach and his wife, were at least partially responsible for that. The Midrashim tell us that in the honor of the birth of his son, Terach made a great banquet full of his friends and colleagues, those who were close to the king. As they left the house, Nimrod's sages and advisors looked up and they saw something strange in the clear night sky. A large star rose in the east, traveling northwards. In the north part of the sky, it swallowed another bright star and then continued on its way to the other side of the sky. Some of Nimrod's wise men were astrologers, and they watched the star as it shot forth through the sky in every direction. Wherever it went, it swallowed the stars in its path. They were alarmed, and they warned Nimrod that he better destroy this baby. Originally, Terach found out about the advice that Nimrod's wise men had given him. And when Nimrod summoned Terach and ordered him to bring his son Avram with him, Terach knew that the baby's life was in danger. So he quickly sent Avram with his nurse to hide in a cave in the mountains until the matter would be forgotten. Meanwhile, Terach sent a message to Nimrod that sadly his son had died. And it was those 3 years that Abramovino grew up in the cave and looked up and looked around. He made his investigations and he thought things out, thinking first that it was the moon and then the sun, and finally know that there has to be a Rabbeinu Shalom on the world. When Abramovino came back and he began to destroy all of Terach's idols, Terach began to realize that maybe he made a mistake. Maybe Nimrod's men were right. So in his anger, because Avram had destroyed his Avodah Zarah and his business for that matter, he took Avram to Nimrod's palace in the hope that Nimrod would punish his son as he saw fit. So Terach, he was the one that brought Avram to Nimrod. His wife, what role exactly she played in this, whether she agreed or didn't agree, is unclear. Apparently, she wasn't all that against it, but she was confused. In her heart, she was proud of her son. In her heart, she was frightened that her son was not going to be burnt. In her heart, she respected her son's courage. But she didn't defend his right and his Mesiras Nefesh outwardly either. So as a result, her tikkun was coming down, and she was the Chana, the mother, who saw her 7 children killed because they refused to bow down to the Avodah Zarah. That was her tikkun. And in this same piece, the Maramipan explains that Terach would have to suffer more. Terach was Eve. Eve lost children, Eve lost his money, Eve suffered terrible personal tsaras, terrible pain. No one could have suffered more than Eve did. It's interesting, there is a memra. We all know the famous story of Avram, the famous Ger Tzedek, the son of the Graf Petatsky, one of the most affluent, wealthiest people in all of Poland. His son became a Ger. With great Mesiras Nefesh, for 3 years he wandered about learning from tzaddikim and Talmidei Chachamim. He knew that by staying in Poland as opposed to Holland, he was putting his life in danger, and eventually he was arrested. Someone mastered on him. Unfortunately, someone who was angry that he yelled at his son in the Beis HaMedrash to be quiet. And tzaddikim later said after he was burnt alive at the stake, despite the fact that he was given the opportunity to renege on his commitment to Yiddishkeit, it is said that he was the tikkun for the first 3 years of Abramovino's life. Growing up in that cave, studying the sun, the stars, the moon, until he came to the conclusion that there was a Rabbeinu Shalom on the world. So everything comes to its tikkun, and everything has a reason. This is shot in the Medrash in this week's Sedra. At first, Abramovino was frightened because he knew that the official answer to the question, why is it that some tzaddikim suffer, is because they are a tzaddik ben rosh. So Abraham was extremely concerned that he would have to personally pay the price for his father's chatoim. After all, if you touch the words literally, that's what it means, that a tzaddik ben rosh has to suffer. So what did HaKadosh Baruch Hu answer him? Amalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Einat Tzarech. Don't worry, he won't have to face these Yisurim. Kvar noyleg mishi yakablei. Who is that? Uff, Eve. Even though Abramovino knew what the Gemara's response was, that simply this doesn't work that way. A child does not suffer for the chatan of his parents, but he wanted his father to have a tikkun. And who knows if his father would have an opportunity to have a tikkun. Therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu comforted him by saying, don't worry, your father has already been reborn into Eve, according to one sheet to Eve was during the times of Abramovino. And therefore he will rectify his own Yisurim. So Terach was an example of a tzaddik ben Rasha. Tzaddik in the form of Eve, ben Rasha referring to his first Gilgul being Terach. And as a result, Abramovino felt good for a variety of different reasons. First and foremost, he knew now that his father would have a tikkun. So while we're on the topic, it's interesting to note, we all know the famous story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who like Abramovino were also saved in the Kivshan Ha'esh. And like Abramovino went into the Kivshan Ha'esh not knowing, not expecting to be saved, but they were willing to be Meiser Nefesh themselves. The end of the story, however, is not so well known. There were 2 Nevi'ei Sheker, Achav and Tzidkiah. And the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar once heard them saying to the people what the people wanted to hear. They said, you can go and do whatever you want, and don't worry, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will not punish you. So she told her father what they said. Nebuchadnezzar refused to believe it. He had different hashkafis of Yiddishkeit that he heard from Daniel, from Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. So he had these 2 Nevi'im summoned, but they insisted that Hashem sent us to tell the Jews that they can do whatever they want. So he told them that if it is true that you are Nevi HaEmes, are you willing to be tested the way Hanani, Mishael, Azariah were tested? Can I throw you into the Kivshan Ha'esh? So they began to shiver, and they said, no. So the king wasn't going to let them off the hook, but I thought that you said you were true prophets, and what are you worried about? So they found an excuse. They said that Hanani, Mishael, Azariah were saved because they were 3 tzaddikim together. But even though they too are also tzaddikim, because there are only 2 and not 3, they don't have a mezumin, that would be the reason that they're going to be burnt. And therefore, they hoped that they would be able to persuade the king that there was no reason to test them. The king, however, was still not going to let them off the hook. So he said, okay, find a third party. So you can be 3 tzaddikim. Achim and Tzidkiah were stuck. So they went and suggested that Yehoshua, the Kohen Gadol, should be thrown in together with them in the fire. They were hoping that his chusim and his nice and titan would protect all 3 of them. But that's not what happened. As soon as the 3 were thrown into the fire, the 2 Nevi'ei Sheker were burned. The Kohen Gadol was not hurt, but his begadim were burnt as an oynish for not giving enough musar, for not being angry enough at his children, who married Nashim Nechrias. The Nebuchadnezzar had Yeshua Kohen Gadol summoned, and he said to him, I see that you are chaviv l'fnei bayrecha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves you. You were zecha to come out alive from the fire. But why is it that your clothes were burned? How come when Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah came out, none of their clothes were touched? So Yeshua's answer was that when you take 3 pieces of wet wood and you put it together, the fire has no effect whatsoever. But if you take 2 pieces of dry wood and 1 piece of wet wood, slowly but surely the fire has somewhat of an effect even on the moist wood. Look, the Merami Pano, the Sefer Gugul in the Shamais, Ois Hey, that Hora, Abramovinu's older brother, was Yeshua Kohen Gadol. Haran, as you know, watched the story of Abramovino being thrown into the fire, and he refused to commit himself. He said, I'll join whichever side wins. When he saw that Abramovino came out shalom from the fire, so he said, throw me in as well, and they threw him in, and he was burnt. Lemaisa, he was Meiser Nefesh himself. Lemaisa, even though we look at this as very derogatory, that he was waiting to see who would win, and indeed, it's not very courageous, but he had an open mind. Everyone else was so overwhelmed with the Avodah Zarah of the times that they wouldn't even consider. And the fact is that he was burnt al Kiddush Hashem, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him an opportunity to come down again and to be saved out of the Kivshan Eish, and that was Yeshua Kohen Gadol. And perhaps it could be suggested because he was somewhat affected in his thinking by the people of his time. Therefore, here too, he was somewhat affected by the Nevi'ei Sheker around him. At least his clothes were burnt. But he himself would have a tikkun for the fact that Seif Chosais, he did allow himself to be thrown into the fire. Now, it's important to understand that our Nisayan is not to know who we are and what we were and why we're here. But our Nisayan is to have the Amunah, that regardless of what difficulties we face in the course of our life, the world is not hefker, and who we are is who we were. And what we do now is going to determine who we will be. Imagine, says the Chavetz Chaim, a man drowning, and he's desperately searching and splashing for something to hold on to. And he sees a branch, or feels a branch. Now, it's a hard time to make judgments or evaluations, but a chacham will understand that if that branch is connected to a tree, the source of his life is using this branch as a way to getting hold of the base of the tree that is going to pull him out of the water or give him secure safety until the danger is over. While the natural reaction is to reach for the branch, and by all means he ought to do that, he shouldn't stop there, but he should continue to try to feel, where does this branch lead to? Does it lead to a bush or to some type of a basis where I don't just have a branch to hold on to with my hands, but I have a place to sit on that is out of harm's way. Abramovino went through many stages until he got to the level of Amunah. That is the basis of our Amunah. He passed by a palace, and he made a cheshbon. He said someone has to be in charge of this palace, someone had to have built it. There were great internal struggles within him, philosophical debates, the whole process, the sun, the moon, realizing they're inconsistent, and it took him 3 years, and he was makir, to his credit, against the winds of the world. He was makir that there is a Bari Olam, and he established the Yamunah for us. But after he was zeicha to all of his madrigas, even during the bris bein hatzorim, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed to him exactly what the whole story of Golus is going to be until Mashiach comes. Every major event in the world unfolded before Abramovino. What does the pasuk say? V'hemen b'Hashem. Abramovino said, I have emunah in Hashem. What is that statement of v'hemen b'Hashem? It is a statement, says the Chavetz Chaim, of an emunah not based on my philosophies, not based on my conclusions, not based on my debates, not based on my observations. It is an emunah that is in my heart. I believe in a Borei Olam. In our Yaakov segment, the Hashem Baruch will talk more about this particular pasuk and the famous Newness about Abramovino working in his father's store and breaking all the avodah zaros, and how that applies to us, Bisman Hazeh. But basically, the Chavetz Chaim says that look at the process. I would think it would be the other way around. I would think that we would start out with simple emunah. Okay, I believe in Hashem. Whatever happens to the Shgacha practice, and from there we would evolve into a much more sophisticated emunah that's based on observations of the world, conclusions. It's the other way around, says the Chavetz Chaim. Abramovino goes through a 3-year process, an amazing 3 years, philosophical internal debates. He analyzes the world, the stars, the universe, the sun, the moon. He comes to a conclusion. There's a Borei Olam. He risks his life, goes against the tide of the world, is tossed into a fire, smashes the avodah zaros in his father Terach's avodah zarah store. Debates Nimrod, who is considered divine from the world, puts him to shame, makes fun of him, mocks him, is thrown into prison. And he comes out of this, he's Lechet in Nevuah. The bris ben Apsarim, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals to him whatever is going to happen in the world. Abramovino sees all the difficult experiences Klal Yisrael will have to endure leading up to Geula. He sees everything. Nothing is hidden from him. And all of this is a stepping stone to the crown jewel of Abramovino's accomplishment. And that is what the pasuk tells us after all these experiences. V'hemen b'Hashem. He was left to a simple emunah in Hashem. A simple emunah, like when a Yid says Moed Ani in the morning and he says, okay Hashem, I'm in your hands. A simple emunah, like when a Yid opens the Siddur and he says, Ani Mamen B'Emunah Shalem. I believe in Hashem. No questions asked, no debates, no intellectual applications to this. It's emunah from my heart. All of the experiences until now, including the Nevuah and the heavenly realms that were opened up in front of him, and the look ahead at all the events of the world, all of that, says the Chavetz Chaim, those are the branches of the tree. Those are the external things. The base of the tree, what Abramovino really held on to and he bequeathed to us, that gives us the koyach to survive, are these two words, V'hemen b'Hashem, simple emunah in a Borei Olam. Nothing happens by chance, everything is Hashgacha pratis. This is the real island of security that guarantees our survival until the Geula. The Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh says, Omer Dekataych. Now, let me first explain. If I, for example, purchased land from you, or I purchased your cow, or your car, or your watch, so you can commit yourself to that sale, or even if it was a gift, you can commit yourself to it. Still, technically, it's not mine until we engage in a kinyan, in a transaction. And different things have different types of kinyanim. Certain things you acquire by lifting, certain things you acquire by pulling, certain things you acquire by establishing a chazaka, a shtar, certain things with the transfer of money, not everything. But everything has a kinyan, an official transaction that makes it mine from you, or vice versa. The exception to this is tzedakah. Without getting into the complexities of all the different ramifications of this, basically speaking, if I donate something to tzedakah or to hegdish, once I verbalize that commitment, it is as if it is already in the property of hegdish, despite the fact that the representative of hegdish did not yet make a kinyan, did not physically acquire it yet. And that rule is called amirase legavaya, what you say. Legavaya, what you say to on high, what you say you are donating to hegdish, is kimsirase lehegid, is equivalent to a physical transfer when one person transfers something to another. So the Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh, Abramovino sees his situation. He knows that according to his own mazel, he's old, he doesn't see any children for himself. And the pasuk says, Kadosh Baruch Hu takes Abramovino outside. Pashut Pshat, Rashi says, outside of his tent to see the stars. In a deeper sense, Rashi says, outside of his official mazel. Don't look at the laws of nature. Don't look at the prediction. Don't look at the obvious winds. HaKadosh Baruch Hu took him outside. Rashi continues to explain it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu took him outside of this world above the stars, and Hashem said, look down, and I will tell you what really is going to happen. And what really is going to happen is, despite all the odds, you see all the stars? That is what your children are going to be like. So vast, so great. Incidentally, the Balaturim says, Yiyah is Gematria 30. Yud and Yud is 20, and the two Hayes add up to 30. And he says that was a guarantee to Abramovino that in every generation, until Mashiach comes, there will at least be 30 tzaddikim who will be there for Klal Yisrael. He doesn't say whether they are open tzaddikim that can teach, or hidden tzaddikim that in the chutz of their avodah, the world has a kiyum. But in every generation, Klal Yisrael does have those from within us to guarantee our kiyum. Others say, V'yomer loi kayezerach loi is Gematria 36. The reference to the more popular number, the 36 hidden tzaddikim in every single generation that are guaranteed for us. But there are different levels, different klinos of tzaddikim. There's a group of 30, there's a group of 6 that stand above the 30. The Gemara discusses this in Masechta Sukkah. Whatever the case may be, the idea is that things didn't look good. Abramovino was shown page by page the whole story of Klal Yisrael enduring Golus until Mashiach comes. And there were definitely periods where things seemed awfully frightening. And the survival of Klal Yisrael and the ultimate promise of the same way you can't count the stars, you won't be able to count the Yidden, it seemed al pi derech hateva hard to accept. So Abramovino lifted himself above those doubts, and he said, okay, so it doesn't have to make sense. Everything has to make sense. How many things in life took place in retrospect that made no sense whatsoever when I look at my own personal life? So Hashem says, this is the way it is, this is the way it is. And therefore, the Hemen Bashem, he had amunah with the Rebbeinu Shalom. He had so much amunah with the Rebbeinu Shalom that this is going to happen despite the odds. That the Yachshavel loy tzedakah, it was considered tzedakah to him. What does it mean it was considered tzedakah? If I come to you and I say, well, you know what, I am going to give you a brand new car. Or I'm going to say, you know, you've always been a positive influence on me, I'm going to give you $1,000. So that was the last time that happened to you. And if it did you take that person's word for it, or did you say, and what does he have up his sleeve? Or you said, or perhaps if you were more polished, you thought and didn't say, I'll believe it when I see it, when it's in my hands. Here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Abramovino, this is the story of Golus. I'm not hiding anything from you. I'm showing you the difficulties. I'm showing you the dangers. I'm showing you the tzarus. And I'm telling you this is what is going to be. Klal Yisrael will sustain all of the difficulties. They will survive, and they will come out at the end shining like the stars, and as many as the stars. And Abramovino not only says Yerushalayim HaKadosh had a munah that this was going to happen. It wasn't some distant belief buried deep in his heart, but the Yachshavel Lo Tzedakah was considered as if it was a done deal, as if it was in his pocket. Because that's the din by tzedakah. When you promise something to tzedakah, it automatically is the property of tzedakah. Tzedakah can come and take it, whether or not you physically transfer it afterwards or not. There is no subsequent physical kinyan when it comes to tzedakah. Your statement is the process of transaction. To Avram, it was his. Didn't make any sense. But his amunah told him it doesn't have to make sense. This is the way it's going to be. And there were no doubts. It was a done deal. And in a sense, the Hemen Bashem means he gave it over sort of as a pekadon to Hashem. Amunah means trust. As if, okay, Kadosh Baruch Hu, I have the bracha, it's in my pocket, I'm giving it to you, you apply it at the right time. How can he give it to Hashem if he doesn't have it yet? Because the Yachshavel Lo Tzedakah. Hashem told him. And his amunah was so great, it was like tzedakah. It was a done deal. It was as if he had it. There were no questions asked. That was the level of Abramovino's amunah, as explained by the Yerushalayim HaKadosh. Let us bear in mind, explains the Ber Moshe from the Yoshev Rebbe, that any statement the others made, any mitzvahs they engaged, whatever they did with us in mind. HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Abramovino all the generations until Mashiach comes. And therefore, Ma'aseh Avos Simin Labanim. The actions of the others are a simon for the children. We have to follow in their footsteps. How could we follow in the footsteps of Abramovino? How do we even come close to Abramovino, who never doubted what Hashem said to him, even though everything that was promised to him seemed to go in the opposite direction? He never even had a shaila, even in machshava. Father Tzavach used to explain to me. He never doubted Hashem's word. How can we possibly live up to that madriga on a consistent level? How can you even say this? How can you make such a statement? Ma'aseh Avos Simin Labanim. Look, the Ber Moshe, we're not saying emulate the others that you can reach their level. It's virtually impossible. We're saying something else. We're saying Maisi Ovis was made with the intent of Siman Labanim. Whatever the Ovis did, they did, saying, okay, I'm doing this mitzvah, the B'nai Shalom, I am being misspal now that my children should be able to perform this mitzvah throughout the generations. And when Abramovino applied the crown glory of his mitzvah, and that is the mitzvah of Amunah v'Hemin v'Hashem, so he said, B'nai Shalom, I believe in what you're saying, even though everything al Piderech HaTeva says is going to go in the opposite direction. I have Amunah in what you say, and he was misspal for that Amunah for us. But Abramovino said, but Klal Yisrael, who is going to experience all these episodes you are describing to me in the Bris Ben Absarim until Mashiach comes, they have to have this koyach of Emunah as well. I have to be able to transmit it to them and to give it to them. Whatever Abramovino did or said, he had you and I in mind. And if we reach deep into our hearts, then it's there. It's there because Abramovino gave it to us. That's what it means, Maisa Avos Siman Labanim. Maisa Avos were done in such a way that they had us in mind. So if the Yid says, how can I work on my Amunah in such trying situations? Relax. Abramovino was already mispal that it's there for you. You just have to be able to reach out to it. Now, of course, even though this Amunah is available for us all year round, but this Parsha, where Abramovino presents the V'Hemin v'Hashem and reaches that level of Amunah Pshuta, this is the Pasha that infuses us with the Kayach. It's a Metzias. The Zohar HaKadosh says each week is crowned with the Pasha of that week. So, in the words of Pasha's Lech Lecha, we find this chizuk. We know. Abramovino saw our fears and concerns. Abramovino saw even more than what we see. We only see up until today. We don't know about tomorrow, but Abramovino saw tomorrow also. And he said, hold on to it. If you have Amunah in the Divine Shalom, you will get through. And that's the Amunah that we reach out for, that Abramovino is extending to us. And when we say, Elekei Avram, and we go on to talk about the other office, but we conclude, Baruch Atah Hashem Mogein Avraham, so we are, in a sense, saying to the Rebbeinu Shalom, that shield of Amunah is within us. Internally, it is already within us. Help us find it. Help us find it within ourselves. The Yisrael Shakter Chaim Avrach explained that the stargazers of the Yom HaSolam that come in many different forms throughout the generations always say that as far as we can predict, we don't see any way out for Klal Yisrael. The Bnei Yisrael will always be in Galus, they say, and they will always have to come on to other nations. They'll always be at the mercy of someone else in one way or another. But that's nonsense. It could be that that's what they see in the stars. But you also have the chus of the tzaddikim, the guaranteed tzaddikim in every single generation, that are mevatel what the stars show. The stars are like a weather report. It shows winds blowing in a certain direction, but winds change sometimes, so they disperse. So the Chatzi that Rebbe explained, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Abramovino, Habit na Shemayim. Look up at the stars, or look down at the stars, according to the respective midrashim, and see, your children, according to stars, will always be in Galus. And that should frighten you. But I am telling you that Toy is a lecha. Toy. As much as these stars attempt to describe one path for Klal Yisrael, that logic or teva seems to indicate, you have a power of Abramovino of being mevatel that koyach, and you have a power of bequeathing, of giving over that koyach to the tzaddikim of every single generation until Mashiach comes. The stars predict one thing for your life. I have lifted you above the stars. In your chus, you were able to go above it. You should know that you have to give over to every single generation of Klal Yisrael this same chus, to go above what is predicted. And Abramovino searched for a method. What can he transmit? What can he give over to every generation so they can use this secret formula to overcome the predictions? And Abramovino came to one conclusion: V'Hemin v'Hashem. It's Amunah. Amunah in the Bari Olam, whether to me it makes sense or not, but I believe the world is not hefker and everything is Ashgacha Pratis. I am in your hands, Rebbeinu Shalom. That is mevatel all of the gzeiros and all of the mezalos and all of the dire predictions. And this is a koyach that Abramovino mastered and gave to us. Indeed, The Gemara in the Masechta Shabbos Dashnos Yisrael Maminim Ubenei Maminim. How do we know they are children of Maminim? Because the pasuk says V'hemin B'Hashem. Avram believed in Hashem. In other words, the pasuk says that Avram established Emunah as something that is in our genes. So if a Yid struggles with his Emunah and he says, look, I don't have the Emunah that I need, so reach out and say to yourself, well, one thing is for sure, I am an Einakol of Abramovino, and he had Emunah. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu allow me to associate myself with you through Avram's Emunah, which he intended for me anyway. The Haman Bashem, in conclusion to the Sefer Toldos Yaakov Yosef, when Abramovino was lecha to this madriga of Emunah. In other words, it doesn't have to make sense, but I believe in whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells me. That everything is in his hands. When Avram reached this madriga, he considered it a tzedakah. He considered it a great gift of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Avram thanked Hashem of being able to be zeicha to this, to really believe in Him. And if we view Emunah as a special gift, and we know we're not deserving of it, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu is more likely to give us that gift. But are we deserving of this gift? Do we even have a right to ask for it? Even if you say no, we do have a right to say, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you did promise our grandfather, and he had a right to ask for it, and that right he gave to us.
This shiur is distributed by Kolodas, 11 Stay Chemet Street, Yerushalayim. For donations, please call 02-5383999. Fax 02-538-0267. Postbox 57035.